Welcome everyone to Dropkick Discussions presented by Sportskeeda. I am your host, Korey Gunz, along with Sportskeeda's wrestling expert, Tom Colohue. And on this week's episode, we'll discuss SummerSlam plans for Seth Rollins and Dominik Mysterio, if Big E needs to make big changes to his character before his singles run, and what in the world is going on behind the scenes of the Raw and SmackDown tapings. But let's start with this past Monday's edition of Raw, where we saw the return on screen of Shane McMahon. It was announced on Twitter before Monday's episode that Shane would be making his return to Raw and would have a earth-shattering announcement. And obviously, speculation ran wild on social media before Monday's Raw hit the airwaves, and it turned out that what we saw was Shane McMahon announcing Raw Underground, which is kind of a pseudo shoot fight club type of deal that they're trying on Raw, where competitors get in a ring with no ropes and just have kind of a knockdown drag out fight to prove who's the most dominant person, I guess, of the underground. I'm not really sure how to feel about this when I first saw the announcement. Tom, what was your just initial overall reaction to this Raw Underground that they're trying on Monday nights now?
Well, it's one of the strangest things I've seen, considering the system they tried to do, whereby everything in the ring is so legitimized and perfectly scripted and everything looks real. And then you go back to people scrapping in the back. But I suppose it's a crazy time. A lot of people, from what I can tell, were just very, very confused. I also found it very interesting that everyone had this information. Everyone with any source had full details of everything that was going on. This was intentionally leaked, and intentionally leaked heavily. Now, there's a few things there I didn't like. I had a little bit of a distaste about the use of the dancers, particularly when you consider people in the crowd have been fined for not wearing their masks, but they brought in dancing girls who were exempt from that. But by the end of the night, I was honestly quite excited to see what would happen next with it.
Now, we know that Shane is a guy that we've heard in the past has dabbled in MMA, and I think there were rumors at one point that he was even at one time thinking of maybe buying the UFC back in the day. And so he's a guy that shoot fights and mixed martial arts have kind of been in his background or been something that he's interested in. Was this Raw Underground idea actually Shane's idea and his creative, or was it actually someone else's idea and they just kind of made him the face of the segment?
It was entirely Shane's idea, and I wouldn't be too surprised to see him stepping into that ring sooner rather than later. Honestly, people in the WWE are really quite high on some of Shane's ideas recently, including back in the Best in the World tournament and the Royal Rumble this year, where he was heavily involved in the booking. WWE have lost a lot of writing talent recently, so they've been leaning on wrestlers like Bryan, like Edge, and the bosses, the McMahon family as well. Even though, for example, Stephanie McMahon isn't there and isn't really involved in anything, Shane's been very vocal.
What did you think about the selection of some of the competitors that we saw on this night one of Raw Underground? I'm going to give myself a little bit of a pat on the back. You put out a tweet before Raw asking for people's opinions if they could put any 4 people in a faction on Raw, who would it be? And I chimed in and gave my 2 cents and said that I would have a faction called Fight Club that included Kevin Owens, Aleister Black, and the Viking Raiders, but, you'd have to give the Viking Raiders maybe a little bit of a makeover. And then, lo and behold, we see Eric involved in Raw Underground. So, again, obviously the WWE is reading our tweets. They probably made a last-second cut and a last-second reshoot of Raw Underground to make sure they slid one of the Viking Raiders in there because they thought, you know what, hey, that's a great idea. So, again, WWE, I'm free. I'll shoot you my contact info. Slide in my DMs because I am available. But what did you think about some of the selection of talent that they used for this segment? And we're going to talk about some in a little bit more detail here in a minute. But just overall, what did you think of the guys that they picked to be a part of this?
Of the people involved, obviously the Hurt Business are sort of the main event players, and that is a tremendous choice. Dolph Ziggler is a great choice as well, and they got a powerhouse in there too, just debuting. So I think they did well there, particularly as regards the Viking Raiders. They've been trying to sort of recreate their characters for a long time. The idea of having them come up as a Viking experience was so badly received that actual character development that they had planned was completely abandoned, meaning that even just recently, at the time when they lost the Raw Tag Team Championships, they didn't really have much character development. That's why we got Carpool Karaoke. That's why this feud with the Street Profits lasted for so long. They're trying to humanize the Viking Raiders. This is a great way to do that. This is also a really good way to rebuild Dolph Ziggler after some very conclusive losses. It's a very different way of doing things. Some people need that. I've only just realized then when you mentioned, imagine Aleister Black in that arena.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar here. You mentioned, them trying to humanize the Viking Raiders. Why does the WWE feel like they always have to humanize their characters? Like, why can't we just have characters? Like, everybody doesn't have to be a relatable person. Some of these, they're supposed to be larger than life characters. If they're supposed to be Vikings, let them be Vikings. I don't want to see them on Carpool Karaoke, and I don't want to see what they're like, at home. I just, what is with this WWE's penchant to always, it seems like once they push somebody to an upper level, and we've seen it, all the way going back to guys like the Ultimate Warrior, Diesel, all these different guys that they give the big push to, and then they feel like, oh, we've got to make them more relatable. We've got to make them more human. What happened to just letting them be these larger-than-life characters and leaving it at that?
There have been a number of times when it's been the wrong call to humanize. I don't think this is the case because the Viking Raiders were not getting the reception that the WWE were hoping for. Even to the point when it'd been almost a year on the main roster, they would wrestle, they would be heavily involved, and they would not get much of a reaction from the crowds. They didn't have much personality. You can be that larger-than-life character. Look at the Fiend. Look how popular he is. But he has that personality. He has that constant engagement, even though he is far out there, as it were. You can still have the Viking Raiders just being Vikings, but we didn't know what that meant. We had no examples of who they were. We had no examples of why they enjoyed it, other than the fact that they were called the Viking Raiders and they were pretty good at wrestling. I'm actually really glad we've got a bit more out of them. I enjoyed the axe throwing. The bowling was a bit strange, but I enjoyed the axe throwing, the smashing through windows, the fact that Eric was always like, oh, he's a big guy. I can take him. I've got this, guys. And I'm annoyed he never got that shot. It makes sense to me he's stepping into that ring with no ropes now as a way to prove himself because he never got the chance to go one-on-one with anyone. Give him the shot.
Now, moving back over to Raw Underground, I agree with you. Having the Hurt Business as kind of the giving a hostile takeover, of the Fight Club, seeing MVP and Lashley and Shelton Benjamin, in their suits and then, just getting down and dirty. I think that was probably the part of the segment that I enjoyed the most was seeing those three guys in that role. Is this the perfect vehicle to not only push the Hurt Business as a faction, but possibly bring back Brock Lesnar as well?
Absolutely it is. I think this is absolutely the perfect arena for all three of these men. The way that they compose themselves. And they can move into sort of a mafia style thing right now, which gives them a bit more reign. And the fact that they're constantly talking about it as a business really does lend itself to that. It does, however, suggest that they'll be moving away from the United States Championship post SummerSlam, which I'm not against. I think they've done this one to death. And if Bobby Lashley isn't taking it, they need to move on. What that does mean is that something has changed in that regard. It could be that Apollo Crews, even without being available, may have convinced McMahon and Pritchard that he's a good enough champion to carry it for longer. I would still like to see Lashley challenge him for a championship he can win, but I don't want it to be at Apollo Crews' expense.
Yeah, in my opinion, I think the creative rights itself, where, you go with this Raw Underground, eventually maybe you get, the Raw Underground champion, and then in walks Brock Lesnar, ready to just take that title of, best fighter in the WWE. I think that would be all. And I think it would be a great way to get to this Lashley Lesnar match, or maybe it's more a fight that we've been hearing so much about that Lashley's been pushing for. Maybe make Lashley the Raw Underground champion, and then Lesnar shows up to challenge him for that crown. To me, I think it's almost too obvious. I think that would be the direction to go. Now, before we wrap this segment up, I do want to go back, and you mentioned it in one of your earlier answers about this shoot fight, quote-unquote, presentation. Do you think that by having this Raw Underground and presenting it as almost like, well, what happens in the ring is, wrestling, but what happens down here is real. It's real fights. It's, guys going at it for real. When the audience knows that that's not the case, this is still scripted, worked shoot fights, going on. This isn't the Brawl for All. This isn't, real MMA. Does that kind of expose the core product of wrestling, or do you think that it somewhat insults the intelligence of the audience to try to present a shoot fight that everyone knows isn't really a shoot fight, and then also kind of degrades the product that we see in the ring, because it's like they're going out of their way to say, yeah, what's in the ring is choreographed, but hey, down here at Raw Underground, this is the real deal?
I'd say this is as demeaning to wrestling as the cinematic era that we're living in is, in that they are both two sides of the same coin, but they are so far apart. And what I want to point out is that there is precedence for this. The first pay-per-view I ever watched was SummerSlam 1998. In that match, we had a Lion's Den match, which was supposed to be the Octagon, a MMA-style fight between Owen Hart and Ken Shamrock. This isn't new. You mentioned the Brawl for All. This isn't new. We are where we are with it. And I've got to say, with everything going on with the cinematic era right now, I feel the WWE is actually being given more of a pass, as it were, and more of a willingness to suspend their disbelief. So really, now's the time.
Let's move on to something else we saw on Raw, which was the further development of the Seth Rollins, Dominik Mysterio storyline. And we saw that Dominik came out and challenged Seth Rollins to a match at SummerSlam. We've talked about this a little bit on the show in previous weeks, about maybe what the plan could be for this match. And, we thought that SummerSlam would probably be the in-ring debut of Dominik Mysterio. But as it stands right now, it looks like it's going to be a singles match. Do the WWE trust Dominik Mysterio enough to actually put him in the ring in a singles match for his debut, as opposed to, maybe a tag team match, with his father as his tag team partner?
Yeah, we were lucky enough last week to be able to break the news that this was the favoured outcome. And Dominik's been training for a while. He's been with the company for about a year now, training, preparing. He had some time away with his father recently, initially because Rey Mysterio's contract was coming to an end and they didn't want him on site if he was out of contract, because then they could batch film things, but also to further Dominik's training. The WWE have a lot of faith in Dominik. They believe, and so does so many wrestlers that I've spoken to, they believe Dominik can play his part. However, the WWE do have backups for last-minute changes, and if they can convince Rey Mysterio to sign a new contract, there will be a tag match. Right now, they're working on the assumption that nothing is going to change.
Would that be the WWE's preference, is to have Rey sign a new deal, maybe even a one-time appearance, deal, to have him tag up with Dominik at SummerSlam against Rollins, and you would have to assume probably Murphy? Or is there even a possibility, based on what we saw on Raw on Monday, that maybe if Rey doesn't sign, maybe they slide Samoa Joe into that role and we get Dominik and Samoa Joe against Rollins and Murphy?
That's certainly possible. I don't believe that Samoa Joe is going to be wrestling anytime soon. I believe this was more of a gauge of how much the fans want to see him back in the ring, which, by the way, is a lot, and also a gauge of how much they want him on commentary instead, which, by the way, is a lot. You can't lose with Samoa Joe, let's be fair. If he's in the match, it's definitely going to help Dominik, but I don't feel Dominik needs it, and neither does the WWE.
Now, since we're talking about Seth Rollins and Murphy, kind of conspicuous by his absence lately has been Austin Theory, who was another member of Seth Rollins' faction. And now reports have coming out that apparently Austin Theory has been suspended, which would make sense and would explain why he hasn't been on TV lately. What can you tell us about this situation with Austin Theory and a possible suspension?
This is a situation that's very much personal to Austin Theory. There is a lot of moving parts to it, so I have to be careful with what I say. He's been gone a while with no mention because, to put it simply, the WWE aren't sure he'll still have a job by the end of it. However, it could be that he'll simply come back, get back on TV, even as early as 2 weeks from now, and it will all be forgotten about. There are many possible outcomes. At the moment, he is suspended.
Let's move over to SmackDown. This past Friday's episode of SmackDown, I thought had one of the best endings to SmackDown that we've seen in a long time, where the Fiend reappears and attacks Alexa Bliss. And I actually was somewhat surprised that they actually let the Fiend put the mandible claw on Alexa Bliss, just, with the day and time that we live in. I was just kind of surprised that they let kind of a, even though it's the Fiend and he's a monster, they kind of let a male attack a female. Again, like I said, I thought it was awesome and it was a great ending. It just kind of surprised me that they were able to go there. However, as great as it was, do we have any idea where all of this is going between the Fiend and now Alexa Bliss and Braun Strowman?
Well, when it comes to the WWE's use of intergender violence and action, as it were, they really choose their moments, and every time they've done it recently, it's had a very strong impact. Look at Nia Jax in last year's Royal Rumble. That still lives in the memory, and it's still something that a lot of people enjoyed. Just seeing Randy Orton in the ring after a little while of Nia Jax, I should say, throwing people about, and you think, oh, there's no one going to throw her out. What's going to happen? Oh, Randy's there. Oh, she's getting thrown out. Oh, she's getting beat up and thrown out. Because you have faith in Randy Orton to attack anyone, regardless of gender. Alexa Bliss, to my knowledge, was very happy to be involved in this particular way. She's been there for the filming of the Swamp Fight, and she's been used for this. There has been a discussion to make sure everyone is comfortable playing the parts that they are playing. There has been speculation that Alexa Bliss will be Sister Abigail. That is not the case. I'm hearing that way too much. At the moment, the whole concept is that Bliss was attacked by the Fiend because the Fiend is calling out Braun Strowman. He is attacking someone that Braun Strowman cares a lot about, because there are not many people that Braun Strowman has been established as caring about. He's not someone who has many friends, openly, as it were. For me, it certainly made the feud a lot more interesting, because this has been going on since right after WrestleMania. It needed a bit of a shot in the arm.
Yeah, it's definitely made it interesting for sure. The inclusion of Alexa Bliss, I think, has left a lot of things kind of up to interpretation. We did a video over on your YouTube channel along with our colleagues Rick Ucchino and Stephanie Chase talking about the Swamp Fight, and we got to talking about how this whole angle and storyline with Bray Wyatt and Braun Strowman is playing out, and that maybe the WWE needs to make things a little bit more obvious for the viewer and for the audience. Do you think that that's kind of the case with this Alexa Bliss situation? Like you said, you alluded to that, people were thinking, oh, well, Alexa must be Sister Abigail, and that isn't really the case. I don't think that's really what they're going for here, but it would also make sense that maybe some people would think that based on what we've seen the past couple weeks.
While I do think the story that they're telling does need to be more clear, I'm not sure how you could protect the Fiend's mystique and also have him come out and say, oh, guys, by the way, she's not Sister Abigail. Just so you're clear, she's not Sister Abigail. In addition, so many people, including another one of our colleagues, Gary Cassidy, loved the idea of Liv Morgan as Sister Abigail. He loved that so much that he was fantasy booking it constantly. How are you going to stop that from happening when there are no indicators whatsoever that it's actually the case? I can't think of anyone who would fit the role worse than Liv Morgan personally, because they are such different entities, and yet people went nuts for the idea. You've got to let people fantasy book and engage in that way. I don't know how they could tell this particular thing differently, but I do feel they need to explain the overall story a little clearer. I do hope on Friday Bray Wyatt clarifies, I'm calling out Braun Strowman.
And over the past week, the WWE's Twitter account put out a poll basically saying, kind of whose team are you on? And, the options were The Fiend and the Eater of Worlds, Bray Wyatt. Is the idea going forward for Bray to play multiple characters? Are we going to see kind of a recurring theme of sometimes he's in a storyline as Funhouse Bray, and then sometimes he may be in a storyline as the Eater of Worlds, the old school Bray Wyatt, and then maybe at the crescendo of everything, then the Fiend emerges and we get our big blow-off. Is this the idea for Wyatt going forward, or do you think that this is an isolated angle with Braun Strowman, and once this plays out, we may not see as many multiple characters and personalities from Bray Wyatt?
There's a reason that The Miz faced Bray Wyatt at TLC and not The Fiend. The Fiend is such a separate entity from everything else in the WWE that he can only really engage in certain storylines with certain opponents. It's much like when The Undertaker first came in. He needed the right opponents to make him work and to make the character come together. It's why one of the things about The Undertaker that was most well received was Kane, because that character was created for The Undertaker and to work in that regard. Same with Mankind. It was made to work in that environment. I'm not sure if we didn't have The Undertaker, then Mick Foley or Glenn Jacobs would have had a job in that role. Glenn Jacobs would probably still be Isaac Yankem DDS. The Fiend needs the right sort of opponents. The idea here is that we can still have Bray Wyatt having feuds even if the Fiend isn't necessarily there. And it's basically all they can do at the moment. They can't have the Fiend feature every week even if he could feud with everyone, because they need character development and to keep things fresh, and they still haven't explained who the Fiend actually is. If we had crowds, I have no doubt this whole thing would have played out very differently, but here we are.
How so? How do you think having live crowds would have made this different?
I think ultimately the Fiend would have burnt out a little bit quicker. Because we would have still had the reactions and everything, but we are approaching at 1 full year of the Fiend now, and the Fiend himself has been in, 5-6 matches? And then you look at what happened with Goldberg. I don't think we would have even got to that match, to be honest. It's hard to say. So many things changed in the lead up to this. And then at WrestleMania, when we had the Firefly Funhouse, could they have pulled off the Firefly Funhouse match with no crowds? With crowds, I should say. What follows was a bit of time off for the Fiend, but now he's back. I think we'd have seen a lot more clamoring for the Fiend from crowds after WrestleMania if we had them, which means this feud could have played out a lot faster. To be fair, given that circumstance, we would have Roman Reigns back as well. So there are so many moving parts and so many variables in it.
Let's talk about somebody else who's playing a big role on SmackDown, and that's Big E. We talked last week that it appears that he's well on his way to receiving a big singles push, and really his first singles push since his debut, really, as Big E Langston, and then he kind of got involved with Dolph Ziggler and AJ Lee, and so this is really the first time in a long time that we've seen Big E out on his own. However, Booker T went on his podcast and had a couple things to say about Big E's character and kind of getting to that next level. And I want to just read the straight quote from his show, and then I want to get your reaction to it. So Booker T said, quote, "I think Big E is going to have to shed a few things in order for people to look at him like the world champion. The gear, maybe, some forms of the gear, the colors. But then again, people say, oh, well, he shouldn't change anything. I'm not going to sit here and say what's what because I don't want the internet going off saying, oh, Booker T saying he needs to do this. I still think Big E trying to be the New Day is not going to work for him as far as him working at the top of the card. I'm talking about being the main attraction. I'm talking about the guy the company has put in a position to be the guy. I don't think that's going to catapult him to that level as far as still trying to be the New Day. You can't try to rehash something that you've been doing for so long and think that's what is going to take you to the next level." Your reaction, Tom, agree or disagree with Booker T?
I completely disagree. And I think Booker T is a perfect example of how Booker T is wrong here. Because I want to go back to Booker T's history a little bit. His one championship reign in the WWE was as King Booker, with the big purple cape and the fake accent and the crown and the scepter. When he first joined WWE, he had an infamous supermarket fight with Steve Austin, where he ended it on a checkout covered in milk. He had a tag team run with Goldust, where he was wearing blonde wigs in front of Goldberg. If Big E wants to make a pancake title and roll down the ramp wearing it, then that's his right. What will take him to the next level is simply the opportunity. We're already there, ready to call him a main event player. We're already here, waiting to call him a world champion. All he needs is the moment.
I'm not saying I disagree with you, but I just want to play devil's advocate here just for the sake of discussion. When you talk about, Booker T being King Booker and, his tag team with Goldust and things, even though those were maybe more comedic characters, they were something different from what we'd seen from Booker T up to that point. They were different than the Harlem Heat version of Booker T that we'd seen in WCW and even in his debut in the WWE. So to his point, we've seen Big E as a member of the New Day for years. He's been throwing pancakes out to the crowd for over a year. He's been wearing the bright colored gear and, dancing and gyrating in the ring for a long, long time. So even though he's at this point where he may be on the threshold of kind of breaking into that next level, is there something to be said, to Booker T's point, about the fact that if he wants to take it to the next level, he needs to do something different, because what he's been doing as a member of New Day has only got him to the level that we've seen him recently, and so only now are they kind of putting the rocket on his back and saying, we're going to make a concerted effort to push you and try to get you to that next level. But maybe he does need something a little bit different to get him to the top of the card, as opposed to where we've seen him, which is, hey, yeah, the New Day's great, but it's kind of only gotten him to that mid-card tag team type of status in the company.
I get what you're saying, and a change sometimes is as good as a rest. However, it didn't work out that way for Kofi Kingston. He still had Kofi Mania despite doing exactly what he had been doing the whole time. If anything, Booker T saying this has really helped Big E, because the WWE have seen the backlash and they know not to fall for it.
Yeah, I think Xavier Woods even tweeted a reply to Booker T that he basically said, in essence, that why would we stop doing what's been working? Was basically his reply to Booker T. So I agree with you. I don't think that we're going to see any type of character change or anything from Big E anytime soon. And I think your point is well taken about Kofi, that, hey, it worked for him. So I think it can work for Big E too.
Yeah, and with the level of performance each one of those men consistently deliver, I would have no issue with every one of them in main events. I would have no issue with a friendly New Day triple threat WrestleMania main event. I would have no issue with that.
Let's touch on some other topics real quick and get some quick hitters from you. We're going to depart a little bit from the WWE before we come back to it. Let's first talk about AEW. We saw this past week on Dynamite that the former Zack Ryder, Matt Cardona, debuted for the brand. We've seen reports that his deal with AEW is maybe a little bit short term, but he is there now, and he said that he hopes to make that maybe a longer term situation with AEW. However, seeing him debut this past week, it made me think, we've seen guys coming into AEW at a pretty consistent rate since their debut. We've seen guys like Brody Lee, Lance Archer, Brian Cage, all come in pretty relatively quick and back-to-back from when there's not a lot of space in between some of these guys that are debuting. Even somebody like Matt Hardy feels like that when he made his debut, it was a really big deal, and even already some, if not all, of that momentum has kind of died down. He's not even really doing much in-ring. He's become kind of a manager for private parties. So even a guy like him and his signing, seems like some of the excitement for him has waned a little bit. Do you think that AEW has maybe expanded its roster a little bit too quickly?
I think so, yes. I think it's also a bit of a bad booking choice to put so many debutants into a position where they come in having lost a high-profile feud. That's definitely true of Archer, Lee, and Cage. Now, at the minute, the roster is so full that we're having tournaments taking place on YouTube outside of Dark or Dynamite. There is a lot of great talent in AEW, and it is sinking to the bottom of that card, seemingly without a trace, because they keep bringing people over the top of them. At some point, you have to take that moment and say, we're just going to focus on what we have right now, because they're in danger of taking on the WWE model of just bringing people in over other people. Matt Cardona obviously discussed his deal with Rick Ucchino, one of our colleagues at Sportskeeda. That interview is on the YouTube channel for you to check out if you want to hear that. And he does detail that he has initially a short-term deal, wants to stay longer. So maybe AEW are already doing that and are just bringing people in for brief appearances, or at least that's the hope, because they keep bringing people in. The reaction is very good and they just sign them.
Let's move over to Impact now. We saw the Good Brothers, Carl Anderson and Luke Gallows, debut for Impact at Slammiversary. But in a recent interview, they've said that they have been in constant contact with their buddy AJ Styles and are trying to get him into the company, that they've been in his ear constantly about coming back over to Impact and joining up with them. I know that Styles' contract situation probably isn't going to lend to him showing up on Impact anytime soon, but what do you think the chances are that before his career is over, we could see AJ Styles either back in Impact or maybe even New Japan again?
I think it's very possible. AJ Styles enjoyed a lot of his time at Impact until the later days. He enjoyed all of his time in New Japan, to my knowledge. But it would be a couple of years yet. He has a couple of years left. And until recently, he was very happy in the WWE. Now, it makes sense that Gallows and Anderson would be in constant contact with him. That's not as easy to say as I thought it would be. And because they're always going to talk, they are very close friends. And it is, of course, AJ Styles who got Gallows and Anderson the job in WWE, who said to them, look, WWE interested, come on over. So there's definitely conversations ongoing. And I think Gallows and Anderson have been on every single airwave over the last couple of weeks, talking to absolutely everyone they can. They are making a buzz, and if they want to make a buzz about AJ Styles is making a buzz back. It is very good for all three men to be involved in this conversation.
Any chance you think AJ Styles might want to cool it a little bit on some of this talk, or maybe ask Anderson and Gallows to kind of cool it on their end, because he's already gone on record when they were released saying that he was unhappy with them being released. He's gone somewhat public. I think, sometimes it's kind of cryptic, but I think you can see through it that AJ Styles is not a fan of Paul Heyman. And now you've got the Good Brothers saying, oh yeah, we're going to get AJ Styles to come over to Impact. Any chance AJ might be like, hey, I don't need any more heat on me than maybe is already there, so maybe cool it with the Impact talk for a little bit?
AJ Styles seems to be above backstage heat. I don't know how that is, but he seems very confident of it because he's saying a lot of things which are upsetting a lot of people. However, he seems to have absolutely lost patience, and if that's what he wants to do, then that's what he will do.
Now, over on Raw this past Monday, we saw on social media that they were hyping up the debut of a new faction that was going to debut on Raw, and we didn't actually see any type of real debut from that faction. We saw a group of hooded figures set fire to a generator outside of the Performance Center, and that was really the beginning and end of their debut, if you want to call it that. Who could this new faction on Raw end up being? Who would you like it to be? Does the WWE even know themselves at this point?
The WWE do know there is an actual plan for these particular individuals. The idea of a new faction isn't something that was written at the last minute. From what I can tell, this is essentially the NXT call-ups who are coming up soon, who have been sitting by the sidelines waiting for the opportunity. For example, Dominik Dijakovic and Chelsea Green have been people that have been mentioned, maybe Vanessa Bourne as well. There is a plan, and they did have the people they wanted in those outfits. But it sure doesn't feel like it sometimes, does it, when you consider that's really all we got?
Yeah, it seemed weird that they would make all this hype on social media about a new faction showing up just to have it be, kind of a backstage security camera type deal where they blew something up. It seemed like it would be more of an impact if they just had that happen randomly on a Raw instead of hyping something up on social media that didn't really actually happen.
To be fair, they didn't hype this one up initially. The news got out via via a wrestling journalist, and then they decided to hype it up in addition. I also would like to point out in Raw there was, I think, 4 different people attacking journalism. There was something about rumors. There was a lot of talk about, oh, Charlie, is that the best you can do for journalism? And Seth Rollins also attacked the rumor mill and journalists. So I think at this point, particularly as regards this faction, WWE are getting a bit annoyed at all the leaks.
Well, let's talk about that. That was the last thing I want to talk about here in this segment is some of the reported chaos, as it's been classified, going on backstage in WWE, that there are constant rewrites of the show. There's no direction in storylines, that they're hot-shotting a lot of things, which maybe this new faction would be an example of, or maybe they're letting some of the dirt sheets and, insiders kind of dictate what they do with their shows, because when things leak out or when they don't, there's taping schedules that are being delayed. And we've even seen people on social media, some of WWE's former superstars make reference to this. Rusev, before last night, tweeted when he saw that Shane McMahon was coming back, a tweet in reference saying that, oh, the WWE says they want to build up new stars, and hey, Shane McMahon's back. Like, makes sense. It figures that, they say they want to build up new talent, and then what do? They bring back Shane McMahon. Maria Kanellis made a tweet that was somewhat similar, talking about the fact that WWE doesn't build up new stars and new characters. You tweeted during Raw last night that, in particular, the women's division has been a spot that specifically has been rewritten over and over again, and is really feeling the effects of the fact that they may not really know what direction they want to go with those angles involving Sasha Banks and Asuka, and now it looks like Shayna Baszler. What can you tell us about what it's like right now backstage in WWE, just as far as from a creative standpoint? What are some of the difficulties that the WWE is facing, and why is there so much turmoil going on backstage right now?
The WWE are in an interesting position. When they were filming everything live, they could do essentially whatever they wanted and then receive a reaction. What they don't want is to put people in a position whereby they are reacting to something that hasn't happened. The mention of the faction. If nobody had mentioned the faction and then we got flickering lights and the like, and you saw a electrical situation being attacked, as it were, with their petrol bombs, you would then make a judgment on that. Instead, people had made judgments way in advance. The taping schedules are changing because they are worried they're not going to be able to do something and have the impact of it being live. And that does affect their ratings because people switch off without being willing to switch on and give things a shot. That's why everyone knew about Raw Underground before it went live. The amount of times they've tried to come up with something unique and different, and then 2 or 3 days later, everything's out and people are already saying it's going to be terrible and I won't watch. So they're in a bit of a difficult situation there. At the same time, there are a lot of things getting leaked, a lot of things getting spoiled, and there are a lot of rewrites partly because of that. They are filming 2 or 3 things and 2 or 3 rewrites to try and make sure that people don't have the full script. And at the same time, there aren't that many copies of the script anymore because so many people are getting full copies of the script. It's a situation which I get why they would call it chaos, and I get that. And certainly with the Raw Women's division, it is being written on the fly right now. But it's not true of every show, and it's not true of the entire show. Certain divisions within, for example, the Hurt Business, the Monday Night Messiah, have been very consistently planned for months. Raw Underground did not debut tonight and was not written tonight. There have been pitches, there have been meetings, there has been set design. The problem, as much as anything, is how many people, particularly wrestlers and employees, are running out of patience. 1, they are speaking up to the management. 2, they are speaking up to journalists. And 3, they are speaking up on social media. AJ Styles being a perfect example of this. People are losing patience, and that is on every single level. It is a hostile environment right now.
It'll be interesting to see kind of how this plays out moving forward. And if you want to know what's going on, make sure that you're following Tom on Twitter. He's at Colohue, and also make sure that you're subscribing to his personal YouTube channel where he covers a lot more things during the week with his personal videos. So I'm sure that if anything of note goes down, Tom's going to be your source and going to be your guy to have it first. Also, make sure that you like and comment on this week's video of the Dropkick Discussions podcast and subscribe to the Sportskeeda YouTube channel. As I mentioned, you can follow Tom on Twitter at Colohue. You can also follow me at Korey Gunz. And check out Sportskeeda.com for the latest wrestling news and articles. We thank you for joining us this week, and we will see you on the next edition of Dropkick Discussions.